Good morning. So last weekend, Pastor Ken, if you didn't catch the sermon, you need to go back and grab it. Excellent sermon. Kicked us off in a summer-long study on the book of Daniel. We're going to be doing about 4 chapters right now, and then we're going to have another series, and then we'll come back to several more chapters towards the second half of the summer. So a couple of things we learned last week from Pastor Kent. Number one, Daniel and his friends were taken from taken from Jerusalem after a war to Babylon. So they were conquered, and then several of the best and the brightest were taken to Babylon. They were fed the food. They were asked to drink the wine. They were asked to go to school. They were enculturated to become Babylonians, no longer God's people and Jewish people. They were really to change. They were given new names. And so Daniel and his friends, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were their Hebrew names. They were all given new names, and they were asked to become Babylonians. Last week, we learned the first issue they came up against was they were asked to eat food and drink wine that had been sacrificed to idols. This was a problem for good Jewish kids, and so they said no. And what Kent taught us about, I thought was a great line. He said instead of being combative, they were creative. And because of how they were creative, because of earning the right to be heard and walking in grace among the people, because of how God acted in their life, they received favor from God, but also the Babylonians and the king. And so the point was very simple, and this was the main point last week. To influence change, you have to engage. And you do this through humility, through wisdom, and through hope. So again, if you didn't get last week's sermon, go get it on our YouTube page, and you need to grab that. Now, we come a few years later into the story, and we're going to pick up in chapter 2, starting in verse 1. This is what Daniel tells us. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar, he's a king, had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and they stood before the king, he said to them, "I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Basically, he had this group, kind of Hogwarts finest, if you will, who are supposed to tell him what his dream is about. They're supposed to interpret it for him. They're magicians and sorcerers or astrologers. That's what they go by. Okay, now this is what happens. Verse 4, then the astrologers answered the king, "May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I've firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble." King's in a bad mood. Okay? He'd been having this dream for several nights in a row. And he's come to them and he's asked them not only to do what's extremely difficult, which is interpret a dream, he's asked them to first tell him what the dream is. Incredibly difficult. They go back and forth with each other. They're like, "Not possible." He's like, "It better be." "Not possible." "It better be." And then they come back in verse 10. The astrologers answer the king, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty," they're talking to the king, "has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer." And this is a very telling line. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans. I mean, think about this for a second. These are the guys in the king's court who are responsible to tell him what the gods think and what he should do in a given situation. They're the ones who, in an ancient court, were assembled to read the stars and divine the times and tell the king what he should do and what he shouldn't do. And they've been so backed into a corner and they have no idea what they're supposed to tell him. They believe it's so impossible that their response is, actually, the gods we've been talking about don't really exist. And all the stuff that we've been doing, it's kind of fraud, king. And what you want is from a God that we know he exists, but he doesn't live among us. And we don't really know him. Now, that's what they're saying. It's an incredible admission from those who are supposed to know the gods. Verse 12, this made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. Why? Daniel and his friends had received such favor from God in the last chapter that they had been moved into the king's court. They were not in the inner circle that was first called in to interpret the dream, but they are a part of that group. They are learning, according to the Babylonian culture, how to be astrologers and magicians and provide wisdom to the king and lead in his court. And they're rookies. They're not in the inner court. But the king is so angry, from the top all the way down to the newest recruits from Jerusalem, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, everybody's going to get killed. That's the order. Now let me ask you a question. If you're walking in a culture and you were in Daniel's position, what would be your reaction? What are your options? I mean, you've really only got a few, right? One is resistance. You can pick up a sword, sort of revolutionary. You can give it your best shot. You can start swinging, as it were, and try to fight your way out. You could certainly try withdrawal. You could gather up your friends. You could hunker down. You could circle up the wagons. You could maybe go underground. You could withdraw. Or you could do something else, which is what this series is all about. You can engage in influence in a way that's really extraordinary and supernatural. And so verse 14, when Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with what? Everybody say this: wisdom and tact. A lot of you didn't say it, and I'm watching you. This is an all skate, okay? Daniel spoke to them with what? Wisdom and tact. Think about that for a second. If you were here last week, there was another guy. His name also started with A, Ashpenaz. Daniel goes to him, spoke with wisdom and tact. He had earned the right to be heard with one of the king's commanders. Here's another commander, different name, different guy. But again, Daniel goes to him. He's earned the right to be heard, and he's able to speak up. And what he does is he decides to engage in influence. He does it through wisdom and tact. And he says, I'd like to go to the king, and I want to ask the king for an audience. So he's going to go to the king to then be able to go to the king. Okay, so what he does is he goes and he goes before the king through this guy, and he stands up in front of the king, the guy who signed his execution order, and he says, I don't want you to kill me and all the other people. I believe I can tell you your dream and interpret it. I just need a couple days to go away, and then I will come back to you. And the king says, okay. And so he goes away. Now, two necessities here. If we're in a situation like this, we don't want to withdraw, we don't want to resist, and instead we want to engage in influence culture. Two very important things that we see in the life of Daniel. Number one, he has an incredible relationship with God, the God who actually does dwell with the flesh. You know, back to that line, the King James Version, when the astrologers say God does not dwell with flesh, they're using a phrase there that is then turned around in the Old Testament to describe that one day God would dwell with the flesh. The phrase Emmanuel, God among us, becomes one of the names for Jesus Christ. And we talk about Jesus in terms of the incarnation, that Jesus Christ actually does become flesh. Daniel knows that God, even before Jesus comes. And so what he does, because of his relationship with God, he gathers his friends. And where does he go? They go into a room, they shut the door, and they start praying and talking to that God. That's what they do. Now think about this. When you're faced with something in the world, something in your culture, something around you that threatens your faith, how many of you have an instinct for prayer? How many of you desire to share your struggles and your fears and your hopes and your worries, not with other people who will commiserate, but with God first? And how many of us will sit and listen until he responds and receive his wisdom on whatever it is we're seeking him on? Daniel has this incredible relationship with God. He circles up and with his friends who also follow this living God, and he goes into prayer. The second thing he does is he has incredible courage. I mean, think about this. This is the king who has signed his execution order. This is the king who grabbed Daniel and his friends from Jerusalem, the city they grew up in. Parents were killed, grandparents were killed, friends and neighbors were murdered. The place was burned to the ground. They lost a war in the ancient world. Do you think it was pretty? And yet here he is, willing to stand up in front of that king, who's the leader of the army that conquered him and his friends, and walk into his court and tell him something. I mean, that takes some serious moxie, right? But here's the thing. This is a really important distinction. This is not just aimless courage and bravado from Daniel. Aimless courage and bravado would be, you're in the presence of the king, grab a sword, try to take him out. It's fight, it's do what you can. Get as far as you can fighting back against him. That would be courageous, but that would be aimless. That would be bravado. What Daniel shows us is different. It's convictional courage. He has such strong convictions as a follower of the living God. And because of his relationship in that prayer closet, he is willing to stand up on those convictions with incredible courage and say, this is what I have to do. And he's willing to take whatever consequences come. So he stands up in front of that king. Convictional courage. That type of courage, like it did for Daniel, also like it did for Jesus Christ, comes out of one place: prayer. And think about it. Jesus got up early often to spend time with his Father in prayer. When the crowds pressed up against him, when he was the busiest, Jesus would slip away to have time with his Father in prayer. When Jesus was about to be arrested and betrayed in the garden, leading to his crucifixion within a few hours, he slipped away with his Father for prayer. If Jesus needed to do that, how much more do we? Yet for so many of us, prayer is an obstacle, not a reality. And when Jesus prayed, we see what we do in the disciples, because they often slept. Some of us, if we want to have wisdom intact, walking through our culture and our world, we need to stop sleeping. And we need to wake up. We need to discover convictional courage that's built out of an incredible relationship with the living God by spending time in prayer with the God who actually does dwell in the flesh. Now, the scripture continues, and it says this, verse 19, Daniel eventually receives the vision. He's gone and he's praying with his friends, and now God speaks to him and answers the prayer. It says this, during the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And then Daniel praised the God of heaven, and he said, here's an incredible prayer. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He's just with his friends praying this. He's not doing this for show. It says he changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. And then he turns, and it's personal. I thank and I praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me what? Wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you, and you have made known to us the dream of the king. Notice what Daniel says in the dream, or in his vision. He says he receives from God what? It's not wisdom and tact. It's wisdom and power. We'll come back to tact in a bit, but here's the point as Christians. We have authoritative power that others do not possess, and we have supernatural wisdom that they long for. They want the power of God in their life. They sense it. They want the wisdom of God in their life. They sense it. And we have it. Yet we've got this culture around us that at times maybe goes against that. And so how do we live in the midst of that? That's what this series is all about. How do we engage and influence that culture? This is not original to me, but I think of culture as a river, a sort of fast-moving current, and appropriate when you live in Pittsburgh, right? So, just think of it like the Mon. You just don't want to really swim in that thing, right? It's still not really well. If you're in a river and the current is pushing you in a certain direction, you have a couple options, right? One is withdrawal. You can get out of the river, okay? And for some Christians, maybe this is you. This is how some people handle culture. They're going to withdraw from the current of culture, and they're going to get out of the river. There's another choice. It's not a good one, but you can just choose to float along. That's called accommodation. That's called going with the culture. There's another option, which is what we see in Daniel's life, and we see in the life of many believers. It's because you're a living person, and you're strong, and you've been trained enough, you can swim against culture. G.K. Chesterton, famous English writer, he once said this, a dead thing can go with a stream, but only a living thing can go against it. And that's the key for Daniel. He didn't withdraw, he didn't accommodate, and he also wasn't dead. He was alive. Despite what had happened to him, he knew the living God. And he was able to tactfully swim against culture because he was strong with God. He was well trained with God, and he knew the living God that they didn't know, that does dwell with men. And so here's the point. If you slip away in prayer, you will not slip away in the culture. Jesus taught about being dead and living. And he used this image of a vine and branches. He said when we're connected to him, like a branch is connected to a vine that bears fruit, when that place where we meet the vine is deeper and wider, then life is going to flow. But when we are cut off from that vine, Jesus Christ, we are dead. We will just float along. Later, Jesus taught in his prayer in the garden on the night he was betrayed that his disciples would be in and not of the world. Be in the river, but not floating along with the current of it. And Paul recaptures the same tension when he's talking to Christians in Rome. That's not a Christian culture, okay? And he talks to them in Romans 12, and he says this: you are to be transformed, not conformed, his words, and you do this by having your minds renewed. The Apostle Paul, who lived in a very adverse culture to Christianity, his friends were being rounded up and killed. He used to do that. But now he knows the living God. He writes later to the church in Corinth, and I encourage you to read both of these chapters. I'm just going to read a few verses. But chapter 1 and 2 of 1 Corinthians actually, to me, seem like a commentary on Daniel. They really do. And you'll see what I mean. Here's a couple of verses from the first chapter. Paul says this: for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. Now think about all these so-called wise men gathered around the king who can't answer him. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? I mean, how foolish did Nebuchadnezzar's men look? They don't have any answers. And so much so they have to say, we don't even know God. We've been frauding you all along. And then you move into the next chapter of 1 Corinthians and listen to this. Now Paul tells us what it's like to know the living God. He says, now we have received not the spirit of this world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. It's exactly what Daniel did. He's going to interpret this dream. He's going to interpret spiritual truth to someone who is not spiritual. That's a gift that God gives every one of us. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him. He is not able to understand them because they're spiritually discerned. But we have the mind of Christ. It's not our own mind. It's the mind of Christ. Daniel gets it how? Life on the vine. He's spending time in prayer and through other spiritual disciplines. Last week we talked about fasting in chapter 1. He knew some scriptures. He knew these ancient prayers that the Hebrews had at this point. He's dwelling in these spiritual disciplines, and especially in this chapter, in prayer. And because of that, he's able to spiritually discern something and have the mind of the living God. Now, for many of us, let's just be honest, right? I mean, spiritual disciplines are overwhelming, right? I mean, a lot of us, we're intimidated by spiritual disciplines. Things like fasting and Bible reading and prayer. A lot of people, they just don't know how to pray. And I want to tell you, I understand it. I get it. About 10 years ago, I was in a small group, my wife and I, and we were a bunch of really close friends. And one of our friends in the group, he just didn't like praying out loud. And everybody knew about it. And like, he's kind of a fun guy, and people were kind of teasing a little bit from time to time, like, hey, come on, why don't you close in prayer tonight? He's like, no, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to pray out loud. Like, I'm just not comfortable with that, And then on this one particular night, somebody else was leading. They were just like, hey man, why don't you close in prayer? And everybody just bowed their heads. No one laughed. And there was no joke. It was just like, hey, you close in prayer. And it was like, oh boy, how's this going to go? And he did pretty well. He had like 3 or 4 like really strong small group prayer, like thank you for what you taught us tonight. Thank you for our prayer, be with our kids, all this kind of stuff. And then he ended his prayer, and it kind of went south pretty quickly. He said, thanks God. Have a great night. Oh man. And he opened his eyes. And you know what? That's okay. I mean, think about it. Maybe we need some minorly embarrassing moments with Christians in order that we don't embarrass ourselves as Christians. Maybe we need to have a little bit of humility and be like, hey, you know what? I've been following Jesus for 10 years. I'm really not sure how to pray. Hey, you know what? I got a Bible and it's got a little bit of dust on it. Could you teach me how to read it? Maybe it's okay that we take on a little bit of embarrassment with our brothers and sisters in Christ to learn some spiritual disciplines so we don't embarrass Jesus. Maybe that's okay. Daniel, however he learned it, learned the spiritual disciplines. And when he's in a foreign culture, he is able to engage in influence because he knows his God, because he knows spiritual disciplines. And in particular, he knows how to pray. If he was lifeless, he would have just been drifted right away. But instead, he's this strong that he's able to swim against the current through prayer. Remember that old hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. All our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege it is to carry everything to God in prayer. But oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear, all because we do not carry, like Daniel, everything to God in prayer. It's not our reflex. And Daniel warns us it should be. He also warns us of something else, that we have to be careful as Christians when we have power and wisdom, how we use it. We talked about this a little bit last week, that sometimes our tactics can actually veil the beauty of who God is. And so here's the point, like Daniel, as Christians, we have wisdom and power, but we must act with wisdom and what? What was the word earlier? Tact. We don't throw the power out there. We throw the tact out there. That's what people see. Tactfully, from the wisdom and power that God gave him, Daniel not only saved his life, but the life of his friends. And he got an audience with the king, was able then in front of that king to proclaim truth about who his king is. Pastor Kent said this last week. That was a great line. I wrote it down right away. He said, we cannot toss verbal Molotov cocktails in the name of Jesus and expect someone to listen. They're not going to listen. They're going to get hit with shrapnel, and nobody likes being hit with shrapnel. This past week, the Supreme Court made a decision that legalizes so-called gay marriage. Everybody's paying attention to the sermon now. Everybody woke up. I checked my couple sleepers. They nodded up. I'm just bringing it up for a moment. I'm not going to talk about it, except to say this. A lot of people, many Christians, posted on social media about the decision. Some of you. Some people were extremely ecstatic. Some people were extremely angry. And most of the posts I saw lacked tact on both sides. There were lots of verbal Molotov cocktails being tossed around. And I am confident that most people were not listening to most people because of a lack of tact. There's lots of people on both sides claiming that they have the wisdom on the matter, but there's not a lot of tact happening. As Christians, tact is incredibly important when you're dealing with the wisdom and the power that God has given you. Because a lack of tact creates a veil where people cannot see who God really is. My understanding of wisdom and power from God comes from Christ. And his disciples argued about it often. Who's the greatest? Hey, how do we use this incredible power? Why can't we heal that person? And Jesus consistently taught them that they cannot use power, we cannot use power like the world does, to subdue, to manipulate, to lord over others. Instead, we use power like Jesus did to serve others. Remember, Jesus, in one of his last acts, he gave up his life and died for his enemies and asked that they would be forgiven by God. That's tact. This is what Daniel and his friends did long before Christ came. And when Daniel finally gets his audience with the king, you're going to see the tact play out. Here it is, verse 27. Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about." He's come back to the king now. This is his audience, and that's what he leads with. Careful. He's basically telling them, nobody's going to be able to do this. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, Daniel says. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. And Daniel now goes into the dream, and he's going to tell him what his dream was, and then he's going to go back through and he's going to spiritually discern for the unspiritual what God has taught him. He tells him this. First of all, Nebuchadnezzar, he's dreaming. And he says that, here's the dream that you had. And he explains, as one of our artists put these together, he explains that in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a huge statue, an enormous man. And he says that on the top of the statue, it was gold. The head was made of gold. And in the middle of the statue, the arms and the body were made of silver. And then it moved down, and in the waist, in the midsection, and the upper legs, it was made of bronze. And then as he moved down, the legs and the feet were made of iron, and there was a little bit of clay mixed in the feet. And then in the dream, he explains to the king, in the dream that you saw, there was a stone that came off of a mountain, and it was unseen. It was from outside of the picture, and it came out of nowhere, and it hit the feet of the statue. And it began to crumble, and as it began to fall apart in your dream, you saw a great wind come from the same direction as the stone, and it blew it all away, and it scattered it out till there was nothing left from the statue. He's got the king's attention. Neb's like, yeah, that's my dream. It's pretty good. Now, what does it mean? And Daniel goes back through, and I'm going to read some of this, but try to just listen. Imagine this scene. He says to him, first of all, he says, Your Majesty, you are King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. Hold up. What did he just say? He's talking to the guy that ruined and ransacked the city of God where he's from. And he's been carried in exile with this guy's army. Friends have been killed. Loved ones have been killed. People are in slavery, including himself. And he's saying that God has made King Nebuchadnezzar his ruler. That God has been behind it all. That is an incredible statement of the sovereignty and the providence of God. You, Majesty, your King of kings, the God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. And then he says to him, you, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. And it represents your kingdom. Then he says this, after you another kingdom will arise inferior to yours, the silver. Next, a third kingdom of bronze will rule over the earth. And finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. And as the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. Folks, this is hundreds of years before these kingdoms will come into being. But what Daniel describing, most scholars agree, is four kingdoms. Babylon at the top, that's the one that Nebuchadnezzar is the ruler of. Followed by the Medo-Persian kingdom. Followed by the Greek kingdom. Followed by the Roman kingdom. And in each one, the metal perfectly represents the kingdom. There'll be another dream later in Daniel that reinforces these positions. And then Daniel continues, in the time of all of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. And it will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure forever. And he says, this is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. Then he describes how in the end of the vision, all the kingdoms of the earth are scattered away, and all that remains is the stone, which represents God's kingdom. This is nothing less than extraordinary. Daniel is able to tell him the dream and interpret it. And not only does it make sense to Nebuchadnezzar, but now, folks, we're talking nearly 2,700 years later in history. It makes sense to us. It all came true. All of it. Jesus references this dream. He references two aspects of it, mainly things that are in these two paintings here. The idea of the kingdom and the idea of the stone. In talking about the kingdom, Jesus' own mother in her Magnificat, she has this phrase where she says that the God is born out of her, that he is going to scatter all the kingdoms of the earth. She understands Jesus to be fulfilling this very dream. But later in his own life, Jesus, when he is on trial, he is accused of being king. He does not deny it. And then what he actually says, referencing back into Daniel, is that he is the Son of Man who will soon be reigning on his throne in his kingdom. At another point in his life, Jesus talks about the stone, and he references it almost directly. He tells a parable of this vineyard. A vineyard is a sign of God's kingdom. It's a symbol of that often in the scriptures. And the vineyard's rented out to tenants. Those tenants are not paying the landlord, as it were. And so the landlord sends some messengers back to those tenants to get the money that is owed to them. And they keep killing the messengers over and over again. And so finally the landlord sends his own son, and Jesus says, surely they'll respect him. But they kill his son as well. And then Jesus turns the table and he says, that parable is actually about me and my kingdom. I'm the son. And then he quotes the Psalms and he says this, the stone the builders has rejected has become the cornerstone. Jesus is talking about the stone that comes off the mountain that sets up his kingdom and destroys all the other kingdoms of the world in the midst of the Roman Empire. And Jesus is saying that stone, the one that's been predicted throughout Jewish past, that's me. I'm the cornerstone. I'm the one that the entire faith is going to be built upon. And people are going to reject me. And then, almost a clearer reference, he says this in verse 18, the end of the parable. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. And so Jesus believed in the interpretation that Daniel gave, but not only so, he believed that it referred to him in his kingdom. Now, back to Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar hears all this. What do you think his response is going to be? It's a bit unexpected. It says this, verse 48. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel, and he paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. And verse 48, then the king placed Daniel in a high position, lavished many gifts on him, and he made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all of its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, how's that for moxie? You like the dream? By the way, what about my friends? He appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained in the royal court. Folks, you get what's happening here? This is a young captive exile, probably in about his 20s, standing before one of the most powerful men that the earth has ever known. And he is standing in his court, and Nebuchadnezzar is arrayed in gold, and he is on a golden throne, and it is rumored that he had lions chained up on the side of the throne just because. And Daniel walks into that room, and he tells him, I can figure out this dream. I'm going to go pray with my guys. I'm going to come back. And he comes back, and he tells him the dream, and he tells him what it means. And what it means is that his kingdom, it's nothing. And the next kingdom is nothing, and the next kingdom is nothing, and the next kingdom is nothing. But then there's God's kingdom, which is everything. And Nebuchadnezzar lays down in worship. What? That's engaging in influencing culture. Nebuchadnezzar, from this moment on, begins a journey to know God. Yeah, we don't know where he lands in life. Next chapter is a little rough for everybody. We'll get to it next week. But this begins a spiritual journey in the life of Nebuchadnezzar and real true influence from Daniel. This is what I would call a thin place. And what I mean by this, and I think it's important for you to know and recognize, is that there's times in our life where, and most often in life, people are sort of, they're not really open to the things of God. It takes something in their life to make that place thinner, where they're able to maybe meet God, or they're open and a little bit more vulnerable. Typically it's a tragedy. It's something difficult they're walking through in life, or some type of epiphany or experience they've had, where it creates that place. It's just a little bit thinner. So an example of this in our recent times was September 11th. That was a very thin place in our culture for a month or two. Church attendance in America soared, highest it had ever been since back after the Second World War. Incredible. People just surged into church to kind of receive truth and, try to anchor themselves a little bit in what was going on. That was a thin place in our country. It was an opportunity to preach the gospel and talk to people about what Christians believe about the, suffering and pain and evil, but also grace and mercy and the way that Jesus Christ has come into this world. We had another example of a little thin place that lasted for a little bit of time just a few weeks ago. We talked about it. We honored in worship last week the 9 who were killed in a church in Charleston. And so for a week, there was this thin place in our country where people leaned in and they were saying, how are these Christians going to respond to someone who came in and just shot them in the middle of a Bible study? And everybody kind of leaned in and they watched and they learned about forgiveness and love and grace. And I've even had some conversations about it with people that don't know God that were intrigued by that. Even this weekend, there was a memorial, and all the networks have been talking about our president leading the country in amazing grace. Whatever you think about the president, he led the country in amazing grace. That is a thin place. People are singing and talking about the grace of God. And so one of the things for us is we have to learn to recognize when we are in a thin place, culturally, in our family, in a relationship, in a situation, in a conversation. When you're out at lunch with that friend from work and the conversation just turns and you're like, whoa, did they just say that? Maybe I'll say this and see what God's doing here. That's what a thin place is. And I bring this up because I want to teach you something here at the end that's very important. Some of us wonder what to do in our culture. It's moving against stream. And, what do we do as Christians when we're in a place that feels uncomfortable, where maybe we're getting made fun of, or we're being looked down upon, or we're being shunned, or maybe in Daniel's case in chapter 1 and 3, where we're being asked to sin? What do we do then? And so here's the point. Number one, if the place where you're in is going to cause you to sin, then you dig in and you do it tactfully. You don't sin. You go against the culture. Daniel in chapter 1 refuses to eat the food sacrificed to idols. In chapter 3, he's going to refuse to bow down and worship. Those are clear sins and going against God. Our culture in America has been for a decade moving towards being a post-Christian culture. There's a little bit of residual morality out there, a little bit of the Christian past around, but for the most part, the things that have made people uncomfortable have been taken away. It's not as easy to be a Christian today in America, nor will it continue to be easy. Just a week ago, just to give you a real practical example, no one in this town follows the NBA for the most part. Any NBA fans in here? I don't, but I was listening to NPR, which I do like, and I heard this story, and I couldn't believe it. So I pulled out my illustration folder and I wrote it down real quick. But it was after Game 2, and it was the Cavs, LeBron, they were playing against the Golden State team, and the coach of the Golden State team, his name is Steve Kerr, and they had won that game. And what had happened was before the game in a pregame press conference, they asked the coach of Golden State, they said, hey, you had a little bit of problem with LeBron the last game. You're going to change your lineup in any ways? He's like, nope. And he just read through the lineup. Well, guess what he did? He totally changed the lineup. And he knew it. So much so, when they won the game, everybody went back, all the reporters went back and asked him, they're like, you sort of lied? No, you did, you lied. And this was his line. This is what he said. They don't hand you a trophy for morality. They hand it to you for winning. And everybody's like, yeah. And he got the trophy. They won the games for the thing in the league. Here's the point. He's right about our culture, but he's wrong about Christianity. God does give us a trophy for morality. Not our morality, for following Jesus Christ. His morality, his living, his sinless, spotless life. And following him, we endure, the scriptures talk about 5 times in the New Testament that we receive some type of a crown or a trophy, and our response is that we'll lay it down and worship before Jesus Christ. So the place where you're in will cause you to sin. You dig in tactfully because you know your God and his ways. But if the place where you are in is thin, then you bring the gospel in tactfully. You try to recognize the situation you're in. It's not up to you if other people are sinning. It's one of the most difficult things for us Christians to understand. It's not up to us. We're not responsible for their sin. We're responsible for ours. And if you find yourself in a situation, a conversation, and you're not being asked to sin, but it's thin, then you try to bring the gospel in there. You talk about the values of the kingdom. You share your faith, and you leave it out there with tact, because God has given you wisdom and power. And so I want to end with these things. Number one, I really think that we need to learn a little bit of tact as a church and as people. And I think part of that is that, go back to what Paul said about us. We have the mind of Christ, and I think we have to work that mind out. We have to work it out and exercise it so that that mind of Christ doesn't go into some sort of atrophy. We have to use it. We have to think. And so this is one of the hearts behind one of our things that we do here at the campus, and it's called our lecture series, Thinkers and Makers. And we've just, as of a couple hours ago, we just launched the website for next year's Thinkers and Makers. So I just want to tell you who's coming. And honestly, go to the website, read about these folks, look at the topics we're going to be talking about, and then you can kind of get an understanding of thinkersandmakers.org. But the idea is that we bring in some of the best Christian thinking in the country in to talk with us about these different areas of culture where our culture is going this way, and what do we do? How do we swim against that? How do we speak to that? And so the first night is in October. Friends Gabe Lyons and Anna Watson-Carl are coming. Gabe is a well-known author, a speaker, and leader in a lot of different ways across the country for Christians. And then Anna is actually she's a chef and wrote a pretty incredible cookbook. And they're going to be talking about advancing the common good through courage and hospitality, two incredible values. In fact, when I made a distinction earlier between aimless bravado and convictional courage, that's Gabe's language we were talking about a couple months ago, and he's going to be sharing a little bit more about that. The next night, later in October, two friends, Jonathan Merritt, who's a very well-known writer and author and columnist, and Margaret Feinberg will be here for a night talking about virtue and what does it look like to rediscover some virtue, and what are some specific virtues that are really needed from a Christian basis in our culture. Margaret's actually also preaching that weekend, which I'm really excited about. She's a cancer survivor, and she's going to be talking about that story that weekend. So if you know anybody from a cancer background, it's just going to be an incredible weekend where she shares her story. And then the last night of our lecture series will be in after the holidays in January. It's called The Skeletons in God's Closet. We're going to be talking about some pretty difficult topics, in particular, hell. Who's pumped? So Josh Butler actually wrote a book called The Skeletons in God's Closet. He's a theologian, a pastor, and a friend. And he talks about these areas that we typically think these are in God's closet, like he doesn't want to talk about them, but he actually does because they're full of grace and mercy. And his friend is coming with him, Preston Sprinkle, who is also a well-known author. If any of you read Erasing Hell by Francis Chan, Preston is the one who wrote that with him. He's written several other books. And so they've got some different views, and they're going to kind of come together and share about that and open up this conversation about maybe a theological area that's difficult for us to wrap our minds around, but it's an important one to understand where God's at in the midst of that. So if you go to the website now, you can sign up to get an email as we release more information about these. We're doing a special VIP ticketing thing that we'll email people about, where you'll get tickets for the 3 of these, plus Q Commons, plus VIP seating, plus receptions with all the speakers, and then some books as well. So we're pretty excited about that. So just, again, go to the website and get that information. The second thing I want to end with this: we need to build relationships with people. We'll talk about how to go against the culture and swim against the stream, is to actually know people and to build relationships with people without strings attached and without an agenda. This is something that I've really wrestled through my life, but you look at Daniel, and he had these 2 relationships, Ashpenaz and Arioch, 1st and 2nd chapter. Somehow he cultivated those relationships with these people who were in positions of power. And when God needed to use those relationships he had cultivated, he was able to, because Daniel had them. My own life, I've had, just God say, you need to cultivate a relationship with that person. And I don't know why, but nonetheless, God says, get in that person's life and just love them, no strings attached. A couple months ago, one of the people I've been cultivating a relationship with, he's in a position of power and influence in the city, and I found myself at a dinner because he wanted to pull together some of his friends to give him some wisdom and some counsel on some of the difficulties he was facing. And I looked around the table during dinner, and it sounded like a really bad joke. We were up above a bar room at a little dinner table, and there were 2 rabbis, a priest, a Muslim imam, and me. I was like, there's something here. But he had gathered us, and then in front of these people, he really honored, not me, he just honored God. And he said, a lot of you don't know Doug, but he has loved me very well, and he's been a very dear friend of mine. And he's never asked me for anything. He doesn't have an agenda with me, and he's just a dear friend, and I go to him for spiritual counsel and wisdom. And he's not a believer. And it's not about me. That's about God. That's the same thing that happened in Daniel's life. So all of a sudden, God uses the relationship you cultivate to engage and influence culture. And so I just want to encourage you to do that, to find some of those people in your life, and God will make it apparent to you how to build a relationship. So why don't you guys stand up? I'm going to close in prayer. I'm going to use the prayer that Daniel actually uses, the one that we've already read, just talking about who God is and his providence over our life. After this prayer, our elders and some of our prayer team, they'll be in the back by where the curtains are. They're here to pray for you. So seriously, if there's something going on in your life, something that's heavy on your heart, we would love to pray with you. We talked about prayer earlier. One of the ways you can learn to pray is by having others pray for you. And you hear how they pray for you, and you begin to pick it up. And then also downstairs in our lobby, love for you to hang out, meet some people, get some coffee. And there's some treats down there, which there aren't normally. So Trader Joe's finest down in the lobby to eat. So enjoy it. Let me pray. God, I come to you with this prayer from Daniel. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things, and he knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. And we thank and praise you, God of our ancestors, for you've given us wisdom and power. You have made known to us what we have asked of you. God, we thank you that this is true. May we continue to walk it out and live our lives, God, with the wisdom and power that you give us, but with wisdom and tact in the world. In Jesus' name, all God's people said, amen. Love you guys. We'll see you next weekend.
There's a cage locked around my heart. I found a way to drop the keys when my failures were. Now my hands can't reach that far.